Section 12 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5, Socrates, Part 1. 1. Personality. Socrates is the greatest name in the history of philosophy, and at the same time its most popular and most familiar figure. J.A. Symonds tells us how the sight of a hemlock plant recalled the manner of his death to a Venetian gondolier. The charm of his personality is unique. We think of the Greek philosophers before and after him as of so many marble statues, but of him as a living, speaking human figure. Yet this figure is surrounded by a sort of mystery. It is still a question, for what did he live and die? An enigma to his own age, he remains an enigma to us. If Plato may be trusted, he was even an enigma to himself. From that fame and that obscurity one fact at least emerges to begin with: the immense importance of the personal factor in his work, whatever the value of that work may turn out to be. 2. Sources of information. Socrates himself never wrote a line about philosophy, and although numerous reports of his conversation have been preserved, it is doubtful whether any two consecutive sentences have been put down exactly as they were uttered. Nor can the numerous busts bearing his name be relied on as faithful copies of an original portrait. It is suspected that they merely reproduce the conventional mask of Silenus mentioned by those who remembered him, as giving a good idea of the sage's unprepossessing features. We know that he was born about 469 B.C., and that by family and fortune he belonged to the poorer class of Athenian citizens, his father being a working sculptor and his mother a midwife. But the incidents of his early life are buried in deep obscurity. It would seem that he practised his father's trade for a time, and then abandoned it in order to devote himself exclusively to the cultivation of his own and of other people's intelligence. Before the age of 40, Socrates must have already gained a high reputation for wisdom, for we find the beautiful, gifted, and aristocratic Alcibiades frequenting his society as a fitting preparation for filling the highest political offices. Some 10 years later, Aristophanes, in his comedy The Clouds, already mentioned as a brilliant satire on the new culture, takes Socrates as a type of the whole sophistic movement, an eager student of physical science, a dishonest atheist, and a corrupter of the youths who come to him for instruction. Plato, writing long afterwards, puts into the mouth of Socrates an explicit repudiation of ever having been engaged in physical speculations, and in this respect he is fully borne out by the evidence of Xenophon, a fellow disciple. We may take their word for it, without excluding the possibility that their master had gone into such studies enough to convince himself that for him at any rate they would be a waste of time. He was no less a genuine Athenian than Aristophanes, and except as a fashionable craze for a short period, physics never appealed to the Attic taste, nor did it owe at any time a single discovery to Attic genius. Like Protagoras, Socrates devoted himself to human interests, but unlike the great agnostic, he shared the strong religious faith which nowhere had struck such deep roots as in Attic soil, and this faith stood high among the causes alienating him and his countrymen from the method of Hippias and Prodicus. 3. Not a sophist. On the strength of his reputation as a teacher, Socrates was popularly classed among the Sophists. His intimate friends, however, justly insisted on the fundamental difference separating him from them. It consisted, to begin with, in the circumstance that the Sophists took pay and that he did not. Quite apart from the direct evidence of Plato and Xenophon, who only knew him late in life, we may gather as much from the satire of Aristophanes on his poverty-stricken appearance, a fact absolutely inconsistent with his making a trade of tuition. The profession of sophist was indeed considered more lucrative than honourable, and an Athenian citizen may well have considered it beneath his dignity to barter wisdom for gold, especially in the case of one's own countrymen, whom it seemed a sort of natural duty to help with advice. Protagoras and the others were strangers, with something of the discredit attaching to foreign adventurers about them. Socrates never left his native city except on military duty, which he performed as a heavy-armed foot soldier in 3 arduous campaigns, on one occasion saving the life of Alcibiades. 4. Irony. Supposing, however, that the position of the paid teacher at Athens had been not less dignified than that of a salaried professor among ourselves, still it was one that Socrates would have scrupled to assume. It would have been dishonest on his part to take money for teaching, because by his account he had nothing to teach. Our authorities are not agreed as to what was meant by this profession of universal ignorance, the Socratic irony, as it is called. Plato gives it a strong religious colouring. According to his story, an ardent admirer of Socrates, one Chaerephon, asked the oracle at Delphi, was there any man wiser than he? The Pythian prophetess answered that there was no man wiser. Much surprised at being singled out for such a distinction, and conscious of not in the least deserving it, Socrates went about seeking for some one wiser than himself, but found none even among those whose reputation stood highest, for their pretended wisdom invariably broke down under his cross-examination, while at the same time he could not convince them that they knew no more than he did. Then at last the meaning of the oracle became plain. Wisdom belongs to the gods alone. No man knows anything, and he is wisest who has come to the consciousness of his own ignorance. One is sorry to question such a beautiful story, but like the Athenian celebrities, it breaks down under cross-examination. Socrates could not have got so great a reputation as is here presupposed without some more positive achievement than a general confession of ignorance, and as depicted by Xenophon, in this respect a much more trustworthy informant than Plato, it is only about natural philosophy that he professes to know nothing, or to hold that nothing can be known, the causes of physical phenomena being, in his opinion, a secret that the gods have kept to themselves. On the other hand, the whole range of human interests lies open to man, and among the rest to himself. 5. The dialectic method. In limiting philosophy to the study of man, Socrates agrees with Protagoras, except that he approaches the subject from a religious rather than from an agnostic point of view. The distinctive originality of the Athenian thinker lies in his creation of a new method. Socrates figures in the history of philosophy before all things as the founder of logic, the first to attempt an organization of reason as such. Reasoning, of course, is as old as language. In a way, it is as old as conscious life. The behavior of the most rudimentary animals is guided by their experience of the past. And long before Socrates, the Greeks had learned to distinguish this power from all the lower manifestations of consciousness, to look on it as constituting their own superiority to the barbarians, the secret also of one man's superiority to another in the state. Then came philosophy, and raised reason to a higher pinnacle still, as the cause alike of physical order and of civil law, the ruling power of the world. As such, Anaxagoras had introduced it to Athens under the name of nous, the one Greek word still known to the most ignorant sporting man among ourselves. Another Greek word for reason, the one used by Heracleitus, is logos, whence comes our word logic, which means the science of reasoning, the analysis of its operations, the systematic exposure of the process by which conception, judgment, and inference are successfully carried on. Socrates did not create the science of logic. That was an achievement reserved for his successor Aristotle. But without his pioneer work, it could not have been created. How much he actually did we cannot tell with certainty, for Xenophon, to whom our most trustworthy information is due, had but a feeble hold on pure theory, and Plato's dramatic presentation of the old master gives such an immense extension to his method that the original nucleus cannot be isolated from subsequent accretions. 6. Definition. We know on the authority of Aristotle, confirmed by the detailed statements of Xenophon, that Socrates first introduced the method of definition and induction. That is, he took some abstract term, by preference the name of a virtue or vice such as courage or justice, cowardice or injustice, and by comparing together a number of concrete instances where those qualities were exhibited, sought to arrive at a general notion of what the word meant, of what we now call its connotation. According to him, such a procedure was necessary in order that discussions on subjects of general interest might be carried on in a friendly and profitable manner. And not only were definitions necessary in order that people might know what they were talking about, but the definitions themselves were to be arrived at as the result of a search jointly undertaken by the whole company, everybody present helping to the best of his ability in the hunt after truth. Socrates, in fact, applied the democratic tradition of Athens to scientific inquiry, not speaking with authority as the Sophists, but as professing to know no more than anyone else, more concerned to ask questions than to answer them, always on the lookout for new facts and new ideas. His method reflected both the deliberations of the sovereign assembly and the cross-examination to which defendants could subject their prosecutors in the popular law courts. Of course, Athens, even more than other Greek cities, abounded in persons having a good conceit of themselves, and pretenders to universal knowledge found a merciless critic in the poorly dressed old man with the thick lips and flat turned-up nose, who, under the appearance of reverence for their superior wisdom and an insatiable thirst for information, by a series of searching questions, speedily involved the pontifical charlatan in a mesh of hopeless self-contradiction. Such scenes no doubt suggested to Plato his imposing picture of Socrates as a divinely commissioned prophet, going about to convince the world of universal and hopeless ignorance, as prophets of another school go about to convince it of universal depravity. But the picture as it stands is not historical, and the real prophet had a message of reasoned truth rather than of reasoned nescience to deliver. 7. Division. More important even than definition to clear thinking is the logical process of division, the distribution of every subject discussed under a number of distinct headings. Descartes, the founder of modern French philosophy, mentions the plan of breaking up difficulties into the greatest possible number of parts as a first step to discovering their solution, and the same method was practiced by Socrates 2,000 years before him. If, for instance, he were discussing the comparative claims of two rival statesmen to the name of a good citizen, he would bring down the question to a specific estimate of their respective services in the various departments of political activity. A good citizen increases the resources of the state, defeats the enemy in war, wins allies by diplomacy, appeases intestine discords by his eloquence. 8. Reasoning. Definition and division are spoken of in logic as processes subsidiary to inference, that is, the discovery of new truths as necessary consequences of the truths we already know. Socrates was fully alive to this characteristic property of reasoning, and illustrated it in his conversations by starting from principles about which he and his interlocutor were agreed. Unfortunately, Xenophon, on account of his very narrow range of interests, does not quote examples enough to show how Socrates habitually worked out his conclusions, but he gives us the valuable information that no man whom he ever knew was so successful in gaining the assent of his hearers, a fact quite inconsistent with Plato's account of his hero as an exasperating personage, reducing everyone to shame, if not to confession, by his dialectical skill. End of section 12.